The Red Sea in late autumn carries a particular quality of darkness in the hours before dawn. The sky above it presses down without stars, a flat, humid overcast that absorbs the horizon and eliminates the visual distinction between sea surface and atmosphere until the two become a single undifferentiated blackness, broken only by the navigation lights of the shipping lane and the dim amber glow of the instrument panels visible through the bridge windows of the vessels transiting the corridor. It is a darkness that makes the electronic picture the only picture. Everything that matters in those hours exists as a radar return, a thermal signature, or a radio emission. The human eye is a secondary sensor at best. The humanitarian convoy had been assembled at the port of Djibouti over the preceding 48 hours. 7 vessels in total, 4 cargo carriers loaded with cereal grain and medical supplies consigned to the World Food Program distribution network in Yemen, 2 tankers carrying fuel oil designated for hospital and water treatment facility operations in Hudaida and Aden, and a single roll-on roll-off vessel carrying a consignment of emergency shelter materials intended for internally displaced persons in the Marib Governorate. The convoy had been organized under the joint administrative framework of 3 humanitarian organizations, had been notified to all relevant maritime authorities through the standard channels, and had received formal safe passage acknowledgement from the internationally recognized Yemeni government and from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The notification had also been transmitted through back-channel diplomatic lines to the Houthi administrative authorities in Sana'a, who controlled the port infrastructure at Hudaida, and whose cooperation was operationally necessary for the cargo to reach its final distribution points. The Houthi response to the notification had been silence. Not rejection, silence, which meant in the operational calculus of maritime humanitarian logistics in this theater that the convoy's safety could not be assumed. The USS Guided Missile Destroyer had been assigned as convoy escort by 5th Fleet at 6 p.m. the previous evening. The tasking order was straightforward in its language and complex in its implications. Escort the 7-vessel humanitarian convoy through the Red Sea transit corridor, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and into the Gulf of Aden to a position 40 nautical miles south of the strait's southern exit, at which point the convoy would be within the operating range of Combined Task Force 153's surface assets and would no longer require dedicated escort. The transit distance was approximately 320 nautical miles. At convoy speed, a constrained 9 knots set by the slowest vessel in the formation, it would take approximately 35 hours. 35 hours through a waterway that had been the site of 14 drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping in the preceding 90 days, executed by Houthi forces operating under the strategic direction and material support of the IRGC Quds Force infrastructure in Yemen, using a combination of Iranian-designed Shahed series one-way attack drones, anti-ship cruise missiles derived from Iranian Noor and Quds platforms, and anti-ship ballistic missiles that had demonstrated, in several documented incidents, a terminal guidance accuracy sufficient to score direct hits on vessels attempting evasive maneuvers. The commanding officer had read the full threat assessment before departure. He had annotated 3 sections of it in red pen, and had discussed those sections with the tactical action officer for 45 minutes before the convoy got underway. The sections he had annotated concerned the Houthi operational pattern for night attacks on escorted shipping, the specific electromagnetic signature characteristics of the Shahed series drone's approach profile that distinguished it from commercial air traffic at the same altitude range, and the documented tendency of Houthi attack packages to use initial single drone probes to activate defensive systems before committing the main strike element. He had not annotated these sections because they contained information he did not already know. He had annotated them because he wanted the TAO to know that he had read them with the same level of attention, and that the tactical decisions made on the bridge and in the CIC during the transit would be informed by the same threat picture. The convoy departed the Djibouti approach channel at 11:47 p.m. The destroyer took up its screening position 3.1 nautical miles ahead of the convoy's lead vessel on a course of 355 degrees northwest. The night was overcast and windless. The sea surface was flat enough that the destroyer's hull generated no spray and made almost no sound beyond the deep subsonic resonance of its own propulsion plant transmitted into the water below. The convoy's 7 vessels strung out behind in a 2-column formation, their navigation lights marking the pattern of a slow, organized procession moving north through the dark. The watch team settled into the rhythm of a transit that had no immediate threats, but required constant vigilance, because the absence of immediate threats in this waterway is not evidence that immediate threats do not exist. It is evidence that they have not yet appeared on the sensors. The electronic warfare suite maintained passive collection on all frequency bands associated with Houthi drone and missile operations, building its baseline picture of the electronic environment and noting every deviation from that baseline with the methodical patience of a system designed to find needles in precisely this kind of haystack. At 1:33 a.m., the first deviation appeared, a brief low-powered data link transmission on a frequency associated with the command and control architecture used by Houthi drone operations. The transmission lasted 0.8 seconds. Its bearing was 062 degrees, northeast, toward the Yemeni coastline. Its content was encrypted and not immediately decodable, but its existence was significant regardless of content. A data link emission on that frequency, at that bearing, at 1:33 a.m., meant that someone northeast of the convoy's current position had activated a communication system associated with drone operations. The electronic warfare officer logged it, flagged it to the tactical action officer, and maintained his collection focus on the 062-degree bearing. At 1:41 a.m., the emission repeated. Same frequency, same bearing. Duration 1.1 seconds. The 2 transmissions together established a pattern, sequential, short-duration data link activations from a fixed ground position, consistent with a pre-launch checklist or a targeting update sequence. The tactical action officer had the air picture at full sensitivity by 1:42 a.m. The SPY-1 radar was in its highest resolution surface clutter rejection mode, its algorithms configured to distinguish small low-altitude airborne contacts from the residual radar returns produced by wave action on the flat sea surface. The air surveillance picture above the destroyer and the convoy was empty. That was expected. If a drone had been launched from the Yemeni coast at 1:41 a.m., it would not appear on the surface radar picture until it was within approximately 25 to 30 nautical miles of the ship, depending on its altitude profile. The coast was 47 nautical miles away. The contact, if it existed, was over land or in the radar shadow of the terrain. At 1:52 a.m., the contact appeared, bearing 064 degrees, range 28 nautical miles, altitude 800 feet, speed 118 knots. The radar return was small, very small, with a cross-section that required the SPY-1 to make 3 consecutive detections before the track management software elevated it from tentative to confident classification. The track supervisor reported it at 1:52:31 a.m. Single airborne contact, probable drone, inbound on bearing 244 degrees, range 28 nautical miles, estimated time to minimum engagement range 11 minutes. The bearing and the heading were aligned with the convoy's center of mass, not the destroyer's position. Whatever the contact was targeting, it had been given a routing solution that aimed it at the middle of the humanitarian formation, not the warship screening ahead of it. This was the probe. The commanding officer had read about it in the threat assessment. A single drone, inbound on a course that bypassed the escort and aimed for the protected assets, designed to activate the destroyer's defensive systems and reveal the specific emissions, engagement geometries, and reaction time characteristics that the main attack package would then use to optimize its approach. The commanding officer understood this with the clarity of someone who had annotated exactly this section of the assessment in red ink. He had 11 minutes. At 1:53 a.m., the MH-60R Seahawk assigned to the destroyer's screen had been airborne for 2 hours and 6 minutes on a standard patrol pattern ahead of the convoy. The crew received new tasking immediately: descend to 600 feet, close the inbound contact, establish visual identification, and report the drone's configuration while the ship's fire control system developed its intercept solution from below. The Seahawk descended and accelerated. At 1:57 a.m., the crew reported visual acquisition on the contact at 4.2 nautical miles. A Shahed 136 one-way attack airframe in its maritime strike configuration, wings level, descending slightly from 800 feet to approximately 550 feet as it transitioned from cruise altitude to its terminal approach profile. The delta wing configuration and the characteristic square-cornered fuselage were unambiguous on the FLIR at close range. Armed. Inbound. No ambiguity of classification or intent. The engagement authorization request went from the tactical action officer to the commanding officer at 1:57:09 a.m. Authorization came back at 1:57:14 a.m. 5 seconds. The commanding officer had been holding the authorization decision in the front of his mind since the contact first appeared at 28 nautical miles, examining it continuously against the rules of engagement and the specific operational context of an escort mission protecting vessels, carrying humanitarian cargo and civilian crew members. An armed drone on a direct approach vector toward a convoy of unarmed humanitarian vessels constituted an unambiguous hostile act under any applicable legal framework. The authorization decision was not difficult. The 5 seconds were consumed by the procedural confirmation sequence, not by uncertainty. The rolling airframe missile launcher elevated to its engagement bearing at 1:57:17 a.m. The first ram came off the mount at 1:57:22 a.m. The launch sound registered through the hull as a single sharp crack, physically distinct from any other sound the ship produced and immediately recognizable to anyone aboard who had heard it before. The missile's motor ignited at safe separation distance, and the exhaust plume curved northeast across the dark sky, tracking the inbound contact on a closing intercept vector. The Seahawk crew, positioned 2.1 nautical miles northwest of the intercept geometry, had their FLIR locked on the drone and watched the ram's exhaust plume converge with the drone's thermal signature in a single frame of imagery that lasted 0.3 seconds before both disappeared from the picture simultaneously. The intercept occurred at 14.7 nautical miles from the convoy's lead vessel. The debris fell into the sea with no secondary detonation. The Shahed's warhead had not armed to terminal fuse function at the moment of intercept. One contact. Neutralize. Range 14.7 nautical miles from the convoy. The watch team had exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds before the main attack package appeared. At 2:01 a.m. and 33 seconds, the electronic warfare suite registered a simultaneous burst transmission on the same Houthi drone control frequency. Not a brief 0.8-second data link update, but a 4.3-second continuous transmission at higher power, consistent with a coordinated launch authorization signal transmitted to multiple receivers at the same instant. The bearing was still 062 degrees, but the signal was broader, less focused, suggesting transmission to multiple receiving platforms spread across a geographic area rather than a single-point source. The electronic warfare officer reported the emission at 2:01:37 a.m. and added a single additional assessment. This was not a targeting update. This was a go signal. The air picture filled in the following 90 seconds with the specificity of a nightmare that had been accurately described in advance. 7 contacts, all bearing 058 to 071 degrees. Ranges between 31 and 38 nautical miles. Altitudes between 400 and 900 feet deliberately varied across the formation to present the fire control system with a multi-altitude engagement problem. Speeds between 115 and 127 knots also deliberately varied. The formation was not in a tight cluster. The 7 contacts were spread across approximately 11 nautical miles of azimuth, arriving from a broad bearing arc rather than a narrow corridor, which meant the ram launcher could not engage them in a simple sequential linear sequence. It had to manage a distributed, multi-bearing, multi-altitude engagement against contacts that had been deliberately spread to complicate exactly the kind of terminal defense the destroyer was now executing. The tactical action officer had his engagement plan established before all 7 contacts had finished populating the track picture. Priority allocation: the 2 contacts on the tightest approach geometry to the convoy, those with the smallest calculated miss distance, if not intercepted, received first engagement priority regardless of range. the two contacts approaching at the lowest altitudes, which would transition soonest to sea-skimming terminal profiles, and would be hardest to intercept once they crossed below 200 feet, received second priority. The three remaining contacts were assigned to the Phalanx CIWS systems as terminal defense engagement assignments to be handled by the autonomous tracking and engagement logic of the close-in weapon system if the RAM engagements did not achieve intercept before the contacts reached the Phalanx's engagement envelope. The RAM mount began its engagement sequence at 2:03 a.m. First missile away at 2:03:04 a.m. Second at 2:03:09 a.m. 5-second ripple separation. Third at 2:03:22 a.m. Fourth at 2:03:28 a.m. The launcher cycling through its magazine with the mechanical efficiency of a system whose engineering had been validated in exactly this scenario. The first two intercepts were clean. Contacts 4 and 6 in the threat picture, the two with the tightest convoy approach geometry, were engaged at ranges of 18.2 and 16.8 nautical miles respectively. Both intercepts produced detonations visible from the bridge as brief, sharp flashes against the overcast sky above the dark horizon, each lasting less than a second, each leaving a brief smear of smoke that dissipated within 30 seconds. The third engagement was not clean. Contact 2, one of the low-altitude profiles, now at 220 feet and descending, executed a terminal maneuver at 2:03:31 a.m. as the third RAM was in its terminal phase. A 9-degree azimuth shift, combined with an altitude drop from 220 to 140 feet, executed in the 2-second window between the RAM's last guidance update and its projected intercept point. The miss distance was 31 meters. The RAM's proximity fuse activated within its lethal fragmentation radius and the warhead detonated, but the intercept geometry had been degraded by the maneuver. The contact's airframe sustained fragmentation damage, visible on the Seahawk's FLIR as a change in the drone's thermal signature and a deviation from its controlled flight path. But the contact did not immediately lose control. It continued on a degraded trajectory for 11 more seconds before entering an uncontrolled descent 8.3 nautical miles from the convoy's lead vessel. The watch team had no time to process this outcome. 3 remaining contacts were still inbound. The fourth RAM launched at 2:03:28 a.m., intercepted Contact 5, another low-altitude profile, at 12.1 nautical miles from the convoy. Clean intercept. Confirmed removal from track picture. Contact 1 and Contact 3 had now closed to inside 9 nautical miles from the convoy's lead vessel. Both were below 180 feet. The RAM mount was cycling for its fifth launch. At 2:04:17 a.m., the radar processing chain reported a transient on the SPY-1 picture. Contact 1 had activated an active radar seeker in its nose section, transitioning from GPS navigation to active terminal homing. The seeker was looking. It had found the convoy's lead vessel, a 28,000-ton grain carrier whose radar cross-section at close range was orders of magnitude larger than the destroyer's own radar profile, and had locked onto it. The fifth RAM launched at 2:04:19 a.m. against Contact 1. Minimum engagement window. The contact was 8.7 nautical miles from the grain carrier. The RAM had to close 7.1 nautical miles of intercept geometry in the time available. The tactical action officer watched the closing geometry on the display with the specific attention of someone who has computed the numbers and knows what the margin is and has decided that the margin is enough because it has to be enough. The intercept occurred at 6.2 nautical miles from the grain carrier. The detonation was the largest of the engagement sequence. The Shahed's warhead had fully armed to terminal fuse function, and the proximity detonation initiated the warhead. The explosion was visible from the bridge of the grain carrier as a fireball above the northern horizon, lasting approximately 3 seconds before fragmenting and falling. The grain carrier's bridge crew transmitted an immediate report on the convoy coordination frequency. Explosion observed bearing north, no contact with vessel, no damage, awaiting guidance. The destroyer acknowledged and directed all convoy vessels to maintain course and speed. Contact 3 had closed to 6.9 nautical miles from the convoy during the previous engagement. The Phalanx CIWS on the destroyer's forward mount had been tracking it for 47 seconds. At 2:04:51 a.m., contact 3 crossed below 90 feet above the sea surface, the threshold at which the contact's profile became fully consistent with a terminal sea-skimming attack run, and the Phalanx engagement criteria were fully satisfied. The 20mm rotary cannon fired its first burst at 2:04:52 a.m. The thermal display showed the contact losing structural coherence at a range of 3.1 nautical miles from the destroyer's hull. The second burst, fired 0.4 seconds later, was not required. The first had achieved the intercept. Contact 3 down. All 7 contacts removed from the track picture. The engagement had lasted 2 minutes and 11 seconds from the first ram launch to the Phalanx intercept of the final contact. In those 2 minutes and 11 seconds, the watch team had managed a 7-contact distributed attack, executed 5 ram engagements, 1 Phalanx engagement, and maintained the engagement coordination necessary to distinguish between the contacts on the tightest convoy approach geometries and those on approaches toward the destroyer, because not all 7 had been aimed at the convoy. 2 had been aimed at the destroyer. The TAO's engagement sequencing had accounted for this. The 2 destroyer-targeted contacts had been deprioritized not because they were less dangerous to the ship, but because the ship, unlike the humanitarian vessels, had a functional close-in terminal defense capability that gave the engagement sequence a margin that the convoy vessels did not have. At 2:06 a.m., the electronic warfare suite registered a final transmission on the Houthi drone control frequency, bearing 062 degrees, duration 0.4 seconds, power level lower than any of the preceding emissions. The electronic warfare officer classified it as a battle damage assessment query, a transmission from the ground control element asking its drone systems to report status, receiving no response from any of them, and going quiet. The absence of responses was its own form of data, transmitted back to whoever had sent the query in the form of silence. 8 drones, none of them responding. The convoy formation had not broken. All 7 vessels were on course and at speed, their navigation lights marking the same patient procession through the northern Red Sea that they had been maintaining since departure. The grain carrier's bridge crew transmitted a second report at 2:07 a.m. All systems nominal, no damage, continuing transit. The other convoy vessels transmitted similar reports over the following 6 minutes. The humanitarian cargo, the grain, the fuel oil, the shelter materials, was intact. The crews were uninjured. The formation was intact. At 2:14 a.m., the commanding officer transmitted an engagement summary to 5th Fleet. The summary was 8 lines. It documented the initial probe drone and the 7-contact main attack in sequence, the RAM and Phalanx engagement results, the engagement ranges, the convoy status, and the current threat picture assessment. 5th Fleet acknowledged receipt at 2:19 a.m. and transmitted authorization for the escort to continue the transit on the planned route with elevated sensor posture. The costs were enumerated in the post-engagement accounting with the same precision applied to every other element of the record. 6 rolling airframe missiles expended from the ship's magazine, a consumption rate that required immediate logistics coordination with the CTF-153 support vessel positioned in the Gulf of Aden to ensure the destroyer's magazine could be replenished before any secondary engagement window. 1 Phalanx burst from the forward CIWS mount. The Seahawk crew had been airborne for 3 hours and 21 minutes, now approaching the outer boundary of their authorized continuous sortie duration. The electronic warfare suite had been operating at full power for 4 hours and 40 minutes and required a thermal management check before the next 6-hour block. The 3rd ram's partial intercept, the contact that sustained fragmentation damage but remained briefly airborne before entering an uncontrolled descent, was noted and flagged for immediate post-transit analysis. The drone's terminal maneuver, executed in the 2-second window between the missile's last guidance update and its intercept point, had been a specific and deliberate evasion designed into the drone's terminal flight control software. It was not a random deviation. It had been engineered. The Houthi forces operating these systems, drawing on IRGC technical support and an ongoing program of post-engagement analysis of their own, had been refining the terminal approach profiles of their drone inventory with each successive attack. The margin on the 3rd intercept, 31 meters mess distance from a contact that then crashed 8.3 nautical miles short of the convoy, was a data point about the direction of that refinement. The convoy transited the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at 11:14 a.m. the following morning, 14 hours after the engagement. The strait passage was uneventful. CTF-153 surface assets established contact with the convoy formation at 12:47 p.m., 40 nautical miles south of the strait's southern exit, and the destroyer transferred escort responsibility at 1:03 p.m. The 7 humanitarian vessels continued south into the Gulf of Aden under the CTF-153 umbrella. The cargo reached Houthi port anchorage 31 hours later. The World Food Program Distribution Coordinator at Houthi confirmed receipt of the grain shipment at 6:14 p.m. on the day of arrival. The fuel oil was offloaded to the hospital and water treatment facility distribution network over the following 22 hours. The shelter materials reached the Marib distribution point 4 days after the destroyer had fired its first rolling airframe missile into the dark sky above the Red Sea. None of the people who received the grain, or who had power restored to their hospital, or who had clean water running again, knew what had happened 320 nautical miles to the north at 2:03 a.m. They did not need to know. The cargo arrived because 8 drones did not. The cargo arrived because a watch team in a sealed, red-lit space had been awake and precise and unwilling to let the geometry close around the vessels they had been assigned to protect. The cargo arrived because the convoy held its course, and the convoy held its course because the destroyer held the line between it and everything that wanted to prevent the grain from reaching the people who needed it. 8 attack drones, 1 probe, 6 ram intercepts, 1 Phalanx burst, 1 partial intercept that ended 8.3 nautical miles short, 7 humanitarian vessels delivered intact, 0 course deviations, 0 cargo lost, 0 humanitarian crew members injured. The sea does not distinguish between the cargo it carries, grain or weapons, fuel or contraband, shelter materials or sanctioned goods. It carries what the vessels on it transport, and the vessels on it carry what the men and women operating them are willing to defend. On this night, in this waterway, the answer to what was being defended was cereal grain and medical supplies and fuel for hospitals. The answer to how it was defended was a ram launcher, a Phalanx mount, and a crew that did not flinch when 8 contacts appeared on the bearing that the threat assessment had told them to watch. The record stands. The cargo arrived. The line held.